And this is a generation of Joseph and his 12 brothers. It's a very moving story, and if you haven't read the scripture, I really do encourage you to do that, because there's so much there that I can't possibly cover in a sermon. But it's about Joseph becomes the central figure of that generation, and the people, and that causes all kinds of conflict and chaos and misery and despair. But the bottom line is that God is there. God is the one that sustains Joseph throughout his life, and it becomes a testimony to us of how, no matter how difficult and no matter how trying our circumstances may be, that God never leaves us nor forsakes us. He's always there. Joseph was... you can get one of those pointers so I can make this better. There today. So we start, just to give you a little review, this is called the period of the patriarchs. And it's the time from Abraham being our first patriarch, and going to Isaac, and then Isaac having two sons, Esau and Jacob becomes the heir to God's promise, and then Jacob, all 12 of Jacob's sons become the heir to God's promise. And so those 12 men initiate the 12 tribes of Israel. And this itself is a huge turmoil and chaos within this family. You know, we think that when we accept Christ into our lives, that we're going to have bliss and joy. But if there was ever an example of there being a constant battle with the enemy, it was in this family. They constantly fought and were tried, and they constantly fell from grace, and then they would come back into grace, and it just went on and on. And it all started with the fact that Jacob is also Israel. He has two names in Scripture. God renames Jacob to Israel in the last sermon when he has the struggle with God throughout the night. And Jacob's life is very much about his struggle with God. Joseph's life is very much about his struggle with man. So they're different. But Jacob married 4 women, and he has sons from each one of those women. And the women are bitterly jealous of each other, and they constantly fight and manipulate and try to control and outdo the other one. Rachel is Jacob's beloved wife, and she is also the one that God will not allow to have a child because of the mistreatment that Jacob and Rachel have inflicted on the other 3 women. And so finally God has mercy, and Joseph is born next to last and in the birth line. These blank lines represent that Reuben, Dan, and Gad were born, and then Rachel didn't have a child. And Simeon, Naphtali, and Asher were born, and Rachel doesn't have a child. Levi is born, and no one has a child. And Bilhah and Zilpah and Rachel don't have a child. Ishkar is born, and the other 3 women don't have a child. Zebulun is born, and then finally Rachel has Joseph. And then later Rachel has Benjamin. Now Joseph is very different and very like his father. Joseph is a good and faithful servant all of his life. He's a good man. Unlike Jacob, he didn't trick or scheme or connive to get what he wanted in life. He was righteous. Joseph was favored by his father, unlike Jacob, whose father favored Esau. And notice the difference that makes in a man's life when the father bestows his love on his children. The child grows up in self-confidence and maturity and joy and is able to deal with the circumstances of his life much better than if the child is rejected by his father. Then Joseph has the gift of spiritual dreams. Both Jacob and Joseph dream. But Jacob's dreams are more like visions that he has of God. Encounters that he has of God. Jacob sees the golden staircase with the angels descending and ascending. And this actually happens. So it's not so much, it happens while he's sleeping in the midst of a dream, but it's a reality. It's an insight into reality. Joseph, on the other hand, someone will come to him with a strange dream, and he will be able to interpret that into what it means in their lives. And both men are estranged from their family at an early age. So we have heard the beloved story for many times of how Joseph's jealous brothers sell him in slavery to a band of Midianites who later take him down to Egypt, and they sell him again in slavery, and there he stays. Boys go back, the sons go back to their father, and they slaughter a goat and smear blood all over it, and they say, hey, look, we found this coat, and it must mean that Joseph is dead. And so his father goes into a grief period that he never comes out of. So Joseph's life becomes a story. We're going to tell it in two parts, but today we're going to focus on the fact that he's rejected by his family. His family rejects him because of their jealousy for him. And so they sell him into slavery, hoping to get the father's favor for themselves. And of course the opposite of that happens. Instead of getting their father's favor, he just goes into a grief period that he never comes out of, and they're miserable, and they suffer because they see their beloved father in pain for the rest of his life. And so he's sold into slavery, and slavery is a bad deal just in and of itself, in that the man no longer he doesn't have the freedom to go home. He can never leave and go be reunited with his family. No matter how well the slave master treats the slave, it's still slavery. It's still, I don't have a life of my own. My life, I only exist to enhance your life. And then, during his time in slavery, the wife of his master begins to lust after him, and she desires to have an affair with him, and he rejects her, and then in her rage she falsely accuses him of trying to assault her. And so there's no trial or anything in those days. If the wealthy person said the poor person, the slave was guilty whether he was or not, and he's thrown into prison and forgotten about. And that's about 20 years of his life. That is 20 years of misery. That is 20 years of isolation. That is 20 years of chaos and living in a prison. And if you think today's prisons are bad, prisons in other parts of the world and in this period of time were horrible. You literally had to live like an animal just to survive. And yet Joseph never loses his faith. Joseph never quits never ceases. He totally accepts and understands that his ability to interpret dreams comes from God. He never forgets the God of his father. He never abandons God. Joseph never loses sight of the dream. And he becomes one of these epic figures in human history where we see this man undergo great stress, and yet his faith only becomes stronger. Finally, and if you know the story, you know that Joseph was able to interpret a dream for two of the other prisoners who had fallen out of favor with Pharaoh, and he tells them what their dream means. And lo and behold, what he says comes to pass. And he foresees that the cupbearer will be spared and restored to Pharaoh's court, and that the cook will be hanged. And that's exactly what happens. And they make the promise to him that they will deliver him from prison if his interpretation of the dream turns out to be true, but they don't. They forget about him as soon as they walk out the door. And they leave him there in the squalor of that prison to suffer and die. Until one day, the cupbearer remembers that this fella in prison has the ability to interpret dreams. And Pharaoh has had this dream of these 7 beautiful cows that are fat and slick, and these 7 poor cows that are starving to death. And it doesn't matter what they eat, they still starve. And so the cupbearer tells Pharaoh of this man, and this man goes to get Joseph out of prison, and he says, "Tell us what this dream means." And Joseph said, "Well, it means that there's going to be a drought, and that there's going to be 7 good years, followed by 7 bad years. And what you need to do, you need to store the extra grain from the 7 good years, so that during the 7 bad years, there will be plenty of food for the people in the land to eat." And that's what they did. And Pharaoh rejoices, he's grateful, and he takes Joseph out of prison, and finally he's released. Now he's still a slave. It's important to realize that they're slaves. And they will be slaves for 400 years. For each generation of Hebrews will be slaves for 400 years. But he now has command over the whole kingdom with the exception of Pharaoh. And people have interpreted that to mean all kinds of things. Some say he was like equal to being the vice president. Others say he's equal to being like some kind of minister. And I'm not talking about religious minister. I'm talking about like Secretary of State or something like that. And I don't know what you want to equate it to. It doesn't matter. What's important is that he was second in command. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there was no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Joseph is finally delivered after all of these years. And so we ask ourselves about our own circumstances. And we think about the fact that we suffer. We suffer because we don't have a job. We suffer because we're not reunited with our children. We suffer because we struggle with our addictions to medications and alcohol and other street drugs. And we suffer with these things and we struggle with them. But how many of us can say that we suffered more than Joseph? Not many. Not many. There was a period of time where I was in a situation where I was quite miserable. And I struggled in that situation for a long time. And what I found out was when I was finally delivered is that God delivered me. But I had to be patient and wait for that to happen. And that doesn't always happen. And it did not happen for me when I wanted it to. And it did not happen to me for years. For years and years. But when God saw the time was fit, He made way. And it's the same for you and every man that lives on this planet. God will deliver you. But in the meantime, the question becomes, what do we do with that time while we're waiting for deliverance? Do we follow Joseph's example? Do we never lose sight of the dream? See, that's what Joseph did. Is Joseph never lost sight of the dream. And he understood what would be expressed by the Apostle Paul some 2,000 years later, which was faith is the conviction of things hoped for and the assurance of things not seen. So Joseph understood the very first dream that he had, which made his brothers so angry, was that one day God would put him in charge and the others would bow down to him. Joseph never lost sight of his dream. Not because he wanted it for himself. Not because he wanted to be Lord over his brothers. Not because he was arrogant and selfish and overly ambitious. He never lost sight of the dream because he knew God. He knew God was a God that delivers. He knew God was a God that loves. And he knew that God was a God with a plan. And his dream wasn't about him being in charge, but it was about God's plan being fulfilled. And that plan always pushes forward. You're part of that plan. God has made you part of his plan. And your dream is part of God's plan being fulfilled. And God will fulfill that plan. But in the meantime, you must keep sight of the dream. You must remember that faith in God is the conviction of things that we have hoped for and not seen, that we are not currently experiencing. And it is the assurance of things yet to come. See, Joseph had faith. And faith is something that we need to carry with us, even when we're in the prison, in the darkest, murkiest, blackest hole of our lives. We have to remember that God is there with us also, and that he will carry us out to a day of rejoicing and light and victory. May God add his blessing to the comments I have made on the scripture. May he add his blessing and the thoughts that you have entertained during this sermon. And may He add blessing to the reading of the scriptures that we have